Hey guys, in this lesson today we're going to be looking at generating three-dimensional views. So the first thing we're going to focus on is oblique projection. So if I said to you now, sketch a cube on the page, I think a lot of you would do the following. So if I start with a square, and we're thinking back to those techniques we practiced in the first lesson, so turning the page, visualizing where we're going to. Nothing in sketching is ever going to be perfect. You're always going to get lines that go off slightly. You've really got to just go with it, and as you flow and progress and practice this more, you'll get more confident. Okay, and then so back to the original point. We've got our square on the page there, and then I'm going to each key point and bring in a line off at roughly 45 degrees off the horizontal. And you can draw the hidden line in the back there, and then you would project the plan elevation off and the end elevation, and that would give you your cube on the page. Okay, so that is known as oblique projection. Now, oblique projection is a little bit unrealistic, really. So if we took an everyday object, so we've got an iPad charger here, if we place that in front of us and look directly at it, you wouldn't actually see the end elevation and the plan elevation coming off in a perspective view. So it's a little bit skewed, and it's not really used as a design tool anymore. But it's important to understand different drawing techniques and visualization techniques, so that when you're presenting your work and using and practicing your sketching techniques and different work, whether it's on CAD, you understand which tools you should be using when. So oblique projection is a bit like the history of drawings. You know, oblique projected designs date back hundreds of years. So in modern day times it's not really used so much, but it's important to understand the technique, so we're going to have a go at that today. So what we're going to do, we'll pick 6 geometric shapes. We can sketch those out first and make them three-dimensional using the oblique projection. So I will start doing some 2D sketching. Bad practice there, did not turn the page. So actually, if we can start thinking about the crating technique, because that will help some of you. Because rather than sort of visualizing dots on the page, if you're creating regular shapes, you can actually just sketch a square each time, which is much easier than watching me try and dot things out, and actually divide that up. So if you just watch me do this, this will help visualize how you might create a pentagon. Okay, we'll do the same down here. So we're just going for 6 shapes at the moment. We draw a square each time. Go for a hexagon this time, so divide it in 2. So crating technique is essentially where you're using, and this goes back to the line tone, you're using faint lines to aid the construction of your sketch, and then you can go in with your medium tone. And don't worry if lines go outside the general construction area, because once we've constructed the main view, we'll then accentuate various lines to really make the objects stand out. So let's go for a right angle triangle. Nice and easy. And the one I always get asked about is how do you sketch a cylinder? So whether we're doing oblique projection, a perspective view, or isometric later on, it's all the same sort of principle with the crating technique. So you take your square, divide that up, obviously in the oblique projection we're going to create just a generic circle. If it's a perspective view, it would be an ellipse. So it's important to distinguish the two. Now, don't be pressured about it. Look, you can see there I've missed the corner there with the line. Might just tidy that up a bit so it's better for this demonstration. So we've essentially, all I've done here to get a circle is I've divided that square into 4. So this point here, where the cross meets the extremities of the square, you need to mark those points. So they're key points. And then what we're going to do is just divide these up as separate lines. So if we view that as a separate line and mark 1/3 in, and we're just going to do that on each of these. Okay. And then what we can do, as long as you can sketch a slightly curved line like that fairly accurately, if you then work your way around your sketch, and you'll get to a point where eventually you can start sketching circles freehand. Okay, so in order to turn that into a cylinder, you would use your oblique projection. So we bring our 45-degree lines off. And this is actually an instance where you need the line from the bottom left corner going back, or at least being aware that it's there. And then what you would have to do is divide the back square up in the same way. And if you want to turn that into a cylinder, you're then just going to go from the 2/3 mark there and the third mark, and just bring your line across. Try to keep them parallel. Remember that notation from your CAD constraints. You've got your double hatch lines together, and the same at the top here. Just jot those across and try and, where you can, keep those parallel. Okay, so we're just going to go back, project our lines off. Don't be too precious about getting the angle bang on. What you've got to get right is your lines parallel. If these aren't parallel, or these aren't parallel, it's not going to look right. Okay. Again, we're looking for that parallel notation. Right, so we've got our range of shapes there, and we can start thinking about making them look a bit more realistic and making them stand out a bit more presentable. So the first thing I'd do is just check, have I got any lines that I want to just adjust a little bit. So if you look at the cylinder and the pentagonal prism there, I pressed a bit too hard with the biro, bad technique a little bit there. This right angle triangle and the triangular prism are a bit more of what I was expecting. It's always good to have that mindset and critique what you've done well and how you can adapt. So what I would now do is either take a slightly thicker fine liner, you can use a Sharpie, we'll come to that later, and what I do is just leave those construction lines in, but just actually mark out accurately the main shape. I'm not actually pushing very hard here with this fine liner. I'm just taking my time to make sure that I follow those lines neatly. So I won't finish off all of these because you guys will need to get working. So two things, thinking about like rendering and how light reacts to material surfaces. So what we want to do is, I mean, the obvious thing that you might have done before is shading. And there's two different ways of doing that. You can get try not to shade just with a pencil. We always use some sort of colour, so giving a representation of the material. So if we do the cube as like a glossy plastic, and I'll just show you a hatching technique, which I often use in my work on the triangular prism. So you can either do that with the biro or the fine liner. So if our light is coming from over here on the left, you would obviously have the rear side of the object would be in shadow. So try to do this if you're doing hatchings in a different at a different angle to the main lines of the object. So I would just start, and this bottom face here would be darker than the top edge. So I would just sketch evenly spaced diagonal lines to represent a darker surface, and then this side might have some light breaking around the edge, but certainly this bottom corner would be a bit darker. Now to indicate it's getting lighter, you just space those lines further apart. We'll look at this technique more, but that basically is a quick way of adding a shadow to an object. Okay, and then you can actually go a step further with that and think about, you know, if this prism was on a tabletop. Drawing the tabletop, it's amazing what you can do with two lines and make something look like it's actually sat there. So what we'd then do is, if the light is coming over here, you can say the light is coming off there, go down to the horizontal there, and you can bring in a parallel line there, and you'd actually end up with your shadow on the floor as well. But don't worry too much about that. Focus on having a go at doing the hatching. What we can then do on a couple of them, you don't need to do it on all, but think about light tone as well. So if I just take this crayon, when you're rendering an object, it's not a case of just getting the crayon and colouring in. Rough out the exterior of it. If it's a face that's in shadow, and I could, if I wanted to, I could just top that up quickly with my hatchings to indicate that that's really in the darkness. And then if I've got that light coming over, if this was like a glossy plastic surface, all you need to do is look at like your phone screen. I mean, they're glass, but it behaves fairly similarly to a sheet of K.E.S resin. You tend to get large straight bands of light going across the surface. You wouldn't normally get on a really glossy surface what we call a gradient. So gradients tend to fall on matte surfaces. So I'll just shade in a gradient here. So you don't tend to get a gradient on a glossy surface. You tend to get clear straight bands of light. Okay, and depending on where the light's coming from, that would either break down there and you'd have light here, or if it was coming along there, you'd unlikely have a band of light there. You'd probably have that whole side in just block colour. So really thinking about the material, the intended material for the object is important as well. Whether it's a matte finish, glossy plastic, translucent. But we'll move on to this work later on. But all I want you to do really is to, before you do any of that rendering work, just focus on sketching your 6 oblique objects. Have a go at doing a cylinder. I said I've mentioned the Sharpie. So you can actually use the Sharpie. If you imagine the object is sat on a table, if you accentuate the lines that would effectively have atmosphere behind them, it will really make the object stand out off the page. So on the cylinder, what we can do there, if I just take the fine liner, we can bring the lines in to make that stand out. And then again, you can use the Sharpie to help with that. So it's important to recognise what you should be using the Sharpie for and what you shouldn't be using it for. So for example, on a cylinder, because the contact point with the surface would effectively be the tangent point there, you would in fact, it's the only profile really where you've got arcs involved, where you would actually use the Sharpie most of the way around. And the point you wouldn't use it on is just this last line that I've got to add in, which is just this arc here. Okay,